Hello, and welcome to the Fairy Tale Magazine's Author Talks, a series where we bring you conversations with writers, poets, scholars, and artists who use fairy tale and folklore in their work. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and today I'm joined by Tish Black, a writer, content creator, and film programmer whose debut collection, Ebony, Blood, and Snow, is full of feminist fire and fairy tale fun. Tish, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk to Fairy Tale Magazine.
In your preface to Ebony, Blood, and Snow, you cite Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Emma Donoghue's Kissing the Witch as inspiration for your work. Tell us a little bit about when you first encountered those texts and what about Carter and Donoghue's writing inspired you to retell fairy tales of your own.
Angela Carter, it's a funny story that my dad lent me Angela Carter's biography. I had no idea who she was. And I started reading it and I gave it back to him because I wasn't really into it. And then I went, wait, this name. And I had like just purchased The Bloody Chamber because I was just getting into fairy tales and fairy tale retellings, that was like a sort of kismet coincidence. So I just finished reading the biography finally. So I'm also fascinated with her life and I want to read more of hers. But The Bloody Chamber was like one of the first things I got into getting into fairy tales and retellings. And a lot of it was just like, oh my God, you can do that. You can do that with fairy tales. You can do that with writing. You can write like this. You can have a collection that is like one of them's like The Bloody Chamber is like basically a novella and the rest are really short. And like, so that blew me away, just like her writing. And I really want to read more of her. And then in my sort of gathering of books of retellings and research, came across Kissing the Witch, and which I know of Emma Donoghue, like she wrote Room, which got turned into that great movie. Kissing the Witch is amazing in that this how the stories are connected. It's so beautiful that how one leads into the other and they're kind of going back in time and asking, who were you before you were this to me? And again, sort of blew my mind of like, you can do that. It can be so beautiful. And so many of those stories, if they have a romance, is a queer romance between women, which also made me go, yes, this is what I need in fairy tale retellings. And so, in very different styles, very different ways, different collections, they both showed me what you can do with fairy tales in the short form, which just inspired me not to be like them exactly, but inspired me to like, now I can do whatever my style is of fairy tale retellings.
Yeah, I love that. We're big fans of Carter and Donahue here at the Fairy Tale Magazine as well. There are 13 different fairy tale retellings in your collection, Ebony, Blood, and Snow, and they rework familiar tales like Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, but also some less commonly circulated tales like The Goose Girl, The Swan Maiden, and even the frame tale of the Thousand and One Nights. How did you choose which tales to work with for your collection? And what method did you use to organize your stories into one cohesive book?
The choosing the tales was honestly just whatever came to mind. Like the Snow White story, the story of Snow White's mother leading up to the Snow White story, Ebony, and Red, the Little Red Riding Hood story, were two that I had in mind for years before I knew that I really wanted to write them down, even before I knew I wanted a collection or this was going to be my thing, because those tales were, I guess, the most common or like the most in my head and the most intriguing to me. And then it just grew anytime I like read a new tale or was kind of sort of reintroduced to something like Bluebeard, which I kind of knew, or like would hear again and be like, oh, but what if Bluebeard was a woman and she had blue hair instead of a bluebeard? I swear I wasn't thinking of my own hair when I did that. Like, oh yeah. Um, and at some point, because I knew I wanted 13, because that's my favorite number, I did start thinking, okay, what tales have I not used yet? And I would think, like, what can I do with? I really love Tatterhood, which is a lesser known one, but I really recommend. And Diamonds and Toads were two that I knew that I wanted to play with, and I ended up kind of putting them together actually in my story, Roan. Um, and yeah, I just think a lot of them, I guess all of them come from the tales that are just in my head, I didn't specifically research and reread the tales, which is funny because later, if I got stuck, I was like, well, let me go back and read the tale and see what I can pluck out to help me out. And I go, oh, that was in the tale. I thought I made that up. So they were in there even more than I knew they were. Um, but I would, yeah, just think of they all prompted like a what if. So I thought, like, what if Bluebeard was a woman? What if Cinderella didn't actually hate her sisters? Or they all have this kind of what if that led me off sometimes to write what I would call a retelling, like a different version, sometimes just off on my own direction. There was some inspiration to start and then it just became its totally other thing. And organization, it's been through a few orders as I, had beta readers help me and stuff. I knew at some point I was like, Ebony is sort of the outlier, so it should be first or last. And Lapis has the final line that is like my favorite line. I was like, this either needs to start the collection off on this note or it needs to like wrap it up with this amazing line. So it's like, well, Ebony's kind of the titular story. That's where Ebony, Blood and Snow comes from. So Ebony first, Lapis last, and then I just tried to create a flow between the sort of darker ones and the lighter ones and the shorter ones and the longer ones. So I think I don't know, it just vibes, it just flows, it just works. I'm also not opposed to someone picking it up and just picking any story in any order. They don't have to go in order, but
Sure, it does flow beautifully. It works beautifully, but each story does stand on its own. So that's a lovely thing to
Mhm.
notice. You do cover, as you said, a wide variety of tales in your book. There's 13 different retellings or reworkings of fairy tales, and you use both first person and third person perspective to kind of lure readers into the different tales, which was something I really appreciated when I was reading the collection as a whole. But one thing that unites all of the stories in the book, I think, is a feminist ideology that almost borders on female rage. And I mean that in all
Mhm.
the best ways. So why do you think it is so important to subvert the roles that female characters tend to play in traditional fairy tale narratives? And why do you think it's so important to imbue female characters, as you have in your collection, with not only personal power, but with political power as well?
Well, I mean, look at the world. That's the inspiration is I live in the world and I am a woman in the world, socialized, perceived as a woman in the world. So it's hard not to be angry. And as I said in my introduction, I sort of qualify myself with like the aim is feminism here, but honestly, I indulge in some misandry because here's a little treat. Let's just stab him, like um, but it's interesting, and I have studied this somewhat of the feminist retellings, which Angela Carter was sort of the first, or we think of like sort of started that in the 70s, and people are studying it as well in the 70s. The idea that fairy tales aren't feminist or they can't be because of these passive women and they don't even have names in a lot of stories. But it depends what tales you're reading, of course. People just go to like, well, Cinderella, she just wanted to marry a prince. It's like, okay, but like, what about this tale from like China about this woman who, is the daughter of a dragon and like, you know, like saves the world. There are some amazing feminist tales, and but the fun of rewriting something like Cinderella is I can put my own feminist bent on it, or I can find the feminism in it, or I can tweak, it's part of what I love to play with it is and I think all retelling authors, you're putting your own ideas and morals and stuff that you want to put into it. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
I think you answered it beautifully. It was just about how you add that idea of female power in both the personal and the political context, which I think is a really innovative way to approach fairy tale feminist retellings in the 21st century.
Yeah, definitely. Like Ash, my Cinderella story is a good example of a really internal struggle and an internal like revolution or revelation in herself of how she's been looking at her sisters and assuming that they're superficial and they're like their stepmother. Um, Whereas in Plum, the Rapunzel story, she hooks up with this group of women, like literally trying to take down the monarchy. And I think that, yeah, it all fits into the idea of feminism and activism because it is very personal and it is about it. And then it also is very big and very like inner and outer. And yeah, I guess I
Yeah,
wanted
I
to
really
try to
loved
tackle it all.
I really love that balance in the stories because so much of misogyny can be internalized. So you had characters that were really working through things both
Mhm.
individually and then on that larger social scale. And I think those are two halves of the same whole. So I really appreciated that thread that ran through your book. In addition to writing, you work in film and content creation. Tell us a little bit about your life beyond the notebook, and does your work ever influence the writing that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a film programmer and I work managing film festivals. Film programming at its simplest is choosing movies to show at a festival or at a cinema or wherever you are. And I've just loved film my whole life and fairy tales as well, but film was like my sort of career focus, what I thought I was going to. And but I think they intersect so well. I mean, they're both storytelling in different ways. The oral tradition of fairy tales and folklore, and the very new technology of filmmaking. And I do bring them together. I make video essays exploring fairy tale film adaptations, both. So I look at sort of the film analysis of it and what they're doing with the tale, which really interests me about fairy tales, is what we're doing with them now. Both of them are just, I really love stories and seeing the different ways we tell stories and the different experiences that we can vicariously experience through film.
I love it. Finally, your author bio describes you as having Coraline's hair and Morticia's wardrobe. And it states that your goal in life is to live in a spooky old house in the woods, right? So you really lean into this dark aesthetic, and we love a dark aesthetic at the Fairy Tale Magazine. How does that dark aesthetic kind of fuel your creativity? How does it manifest in the work that you do, particularly the work with fairy tales?
Honestly, it's a lot. I've always had like the witchy aesthetic from a young age and been interested in witchy stuff, and that definitely overlaps with fairy tale stuff because fairy tales are magical. Um, But I think of it more as like an aesthetic when I talk about like Morticia's wardrobe and stuff. I'm like, I wear all black, black and gold. That's where the cover is black and gold. That's my thing. Um, but yeah, it does lend itself to that sort of witchy empowerment, aesthetic vibe kind of movement that is happening right now when women really embracing the witch as a symbol or literally practicing witchcraft, but also just, yeah, using it as sort of a symbol of power and claiming that for themselves. The way that some people claim words that used to be slurs, and now we claim it back and say, actually, this is what gives me power. It's inner power, it's the community, like sisterhood. Um, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of that in the book. I think the cover, my black and gold cover, really matches the book. Although there are some like really cute, fun, a couple of fun little stories in there, but um, it is, yeah, it's a vibe. It's my thing.
There's nothing wrong with a pop of light in the middle of a dark
Yeah.
aesthetic, right? We love the balance here at the Fairy Tale Magazine. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a delight to talk with you and get to know a little bit more about your creative process. If you're interested in learning more about Tish, you can visit her website, tishblack.com, or follow her content on social media under the handle Tales with Tish. And don't forget to order your copy of Ebony, Blood, and Snow. We will have a review of it up soon at the Fairy Tale Magazine, but spoiler alert, I loved it, and I think that you will love it too. So, once again, for everyone at the Fairy Tale Magazine, I'm Kelly Jarvis. This has been Author Talks. Thanks for watching.